There is one detail in this file that sounds almost too convenient. Daniel left the house that morning.
More than half an hour later, his wife texted him.
That message should have been one of the safest pieces of evidence in the entire investigation.
If Chris was still texting her husband after he had already driven away, then whatever happened inside that house must have happened without him there.
Simple. Except it wasn't. Because months later, investigators would discover that the message proving Chris was alive wasn't actually sent by Chris. And once the detail fell apart, a lot of other things started falling apart with it. The stalker. The threatening emails. The photographs. The break-in. Even the person police had spent weeks trying to identify. But nobody knew any of that yet on December 14, 2023. Just after noon, Daniel called the non-emergency line in Broomfield, Colorado.
The way he described the situation was almost restrained. He was at work, roughly 40 minutes away from home, and he couldn't reach his wife.
Chris wasn't answering texts.
She wasn't picking up her phone.
Maybe it was nothing. But Daniel didn't think it felt right. And there was a reason.
For more than 2 months, Chris and Daniel had supposedly been living under the attention of a stalker. Not somebody who had sent one strange message and disappeared.
This person had been persistent. Different phone numbers. Different email accounts. Threats. References to Chris's movements. References to Daniel's workplace.
Messages suggesting that someone was watching them closely enough to know where they went and when they arrived. Some of those messages had become death threats.
Police already knew about them. They just didn't know who was sending them. So when Daniel told dispatch that his wife had suddenly stopped responding, this wasn't just a husband wondering why his spouse hadn't texted back. There was already a threat hanging over the house. Daniel asked whether somebody could check on her.
Around 12:28 p.m., an officer reached the home. The first thing he noticed was small.
Almost stupidly small.
There was a video doorbell mounted near the entrance. And someone had covered the lens with a strip of blue tape.
Think about that for a second. This was a family that believed somebody had been stalking them. A family that had installed cameras because they were afraid. And the camera pointing directly at the front door had been deliberately blinded. The officer knocked. No answer.
He moved around the outside of the house, shining his flashlight through windows, looking for movement.
Nothing.
The garage had a narrow window positioned high above the ground. The officer couldn't see through it normally, so he pulled his patrol vehicle close, climbed onto the bumper, and looked inside. A woman was lying on the concrete floor.
She wasn't moving. The officer dropped down, called for additional units, ran back to the entrance and forced his way inside. The house was cleared room by room. Nobody else was found.
The woman in the garage was Chris.
She had a serious blunt force injury to the head and a fatal stab wound to the chest.
The officer began CPR and opened the garage door so emergency medical personnel could get inside. As the door rose, he saw somebody standing outside.
An older woman. She bent down and looked into the garage. Her name was Linda.
She was Chris's mother. Daniel had called her after contacting police and asked her to go to the house because he was worried.
Emergency crews arrived within minutes.
Chris was pronounced dead.
She was 43 years old.
The medical examiner would estimate that she had died around 8 o'clock that morning, hours before anyone looked through that garage window.
Daniel eventually arrived from work.
According to the account in the case file, he collapsed when he learned what had happened. He kept repeating that he had failed to protect her. That he should have protected her. And if you only knew the situation the way police knew it in those first hours, that reaction made sense.
Because Daniel wasn't just talking about a random attacker. There was already somebody out there. Or at least everyone thought there was. Police brought Daniel in to give a statement.
He described the morning as ordinary.
The couple had divided up the school runs for their children.
Daniel took one child to a bus stop early in the morning, then returned home.
Chris drove another child to school. Daniel said he eventually left for work around 8:20. The house, according to his account, was normal when he left. Chris was fine. And then came that message. 8:56 a.m. Chris texted Daniel asking whether he could pick up one of the children that afternoon. Daniel responded by asking what time. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Calls went unanswered. Daniel told investigators that this was unlike Chris. She might not respond instantly, but she responded. Always. By 12:19, he had become worried enough to call police. And right there, sitting inside Daniel's phone, was a timeline that seemed to make sense. Daniel leaves around 8:20. Chris messages him at 8:56. Whatever happened to her must have happened sometime after that. Meaning Daniel was already on his way to work. If you're investigating that room, that's hard to ignore. But the detectives asked Daniel the question they had to ask. Who would want to hurt Chris? Daniel didn't need much time. He gave them a name. Anthony Holland. A man Chris had dated more than 20 years earlier. According to Daniel, Anthony was the person who had been stalking his wife for months. He was the one sending messages. He was the one making threats. He was the one who had photographed Daniel without his knowledge. And if that was true, police weren't starting from zero. They already had a suspect. The problem was that almost everything they thought they knew about that suspect was about to become unstable. Because to understand why Anthony looked so convincing, you have to go back 2 months and look at the first strange thing that happened around this house. Not a threatening text. Not an email. A missing key. And the person who supposedly stole it had taken almost nothing else. Late September, Daniel came home and saw someone leaving the property. He described a figure moving quickly away from the house. Blue jeans. A gray top. No clear view of the face. Daniel and Chris checked the home. Cash was still there. Jewelry was still there. Nothing valuable seemed to be missing. Except one thing. A spare key that had been kept in the garage. That's a strange kind of burglary. If someone breaks into your house and takes jewelry, you understand the motive. Money. If someone enters your home, leaves the expensive things behind, and takes only a key, now you have a different problem. Because a key is useful only if the person plans to use it. Daniel contacted police. The locks were changed. But changing the locks didn't answer the question hanging over the family. Who had been inside? And why had that person wanted access rather than property? Roughly 10 days later, Chris received the first message. October 2nd. Unknown number. The sender identified himself as Anthony. The message was casual. He said he went to Boulder often and asked whether Chris wanted to meet. Chris knew the name. Anthony Holland wasn't a stranger. To understand why his name immediately made sense when it appeared on her phone, you need just enough of their history. Chris had dated Anthony when they were young. They had worked at the same department store. Their lives eventually moved in very different directions. Chris had been academically exceptional. She graduated at the top of her high school class, received a scholarship, studied chemical engineering at the Colorado School of Mines and built a long career as a project manager at Agilent Technologies. Her father had emigrated from Norway in 1974 and later worked as an aerospace engineer, and Chris seems to have inherited some of that technical mindset. She was organized. Methodical. She liked understanding how things worked. She also danced. Ballet and modern dance had been part of her life since childhood, and she continued even after marriage and children. When her youngest was only 2, Chris performed a mix of hip-hop and classical ballet that even received local news coverage. So when this old boyfriend suddenly appeared on her phone more than 20 years later, it was odd, but not immediately terrifying. Anthony had contacted her occasionally over the years. Sometimes on Facebook. Usually something emotional. Something along the lines of missing her. Chris had declined. The last known contact had been around 2016. 7 years of silence followed. Then came the October message. Chris didn't respond. One day later, the tone changed completely. The same apparent sender told her she should have said yes when she had the chance. Then he told her to die. That escalation matters. One unanswered invitation. 24 hours later, hostility. And the messages didn't stop there. Different phone numbers started appearing. Different emails. Different platforms. But the theme stayed remarkably consistent. Somebody wanted Chris to believe she was being watched. By the end of October, that feeling moved from the screen into the real world. Halloween. October 31st. Chris received an email containing a photograph of Daniel. He was standing near his workplace parking area. The picture appeared to have been taken from close range. Not from across a highway. Not from a distant building. Close. The accompanying message mocked Daniel and implied he wouldn't be allowed to live peacefully. This changed the situation for Chris. Before that photograph, she could at least tell herself that anonymous texts were anonymous texts. Ugly. Disturbing. But digital. A photograph taken near Daniel's workplace meant somebody knew where he worked. What he drove. Where he parked. Possibly when he arrived. Chris contacted police. And from here, the harassment became harder to dismiss as some bitter person sending messages from another state. Strange men began contacting Chris directly. Some sent sexually explicit material. Others sent crude messages. Chris didn't understand why complete strangers suddenly had her private number. Police eventually learned that somebody had posted an advertisement on an adult-oriented website using Chris's real name and phone number. That meant anyone seeing the ad could contact her directly. Now the harassment had multiplied itself. The original sender didn't even have to message Chris constantly anymore. Strangers could do it for him. Then came messages that suggested physical surveillance. One said the sender had seen Chris at the dentist. That one bothered her. Because Chris really had been at a dental office that day. And the office wasn't sitting alone in an empty building. It was inside a larger commercial area surrounded by numerous businesses. A person using only rough phone location data might know Chris was somewhere in that area. But knowing which specific office she walked into? That's different. Another message told her that her vehicle registration had expired. She checked. It had. Police inspected her car. They looked for a GPS tracker or some kind of suspicious device. Nothing. No tracker. No obvious explanation. And that's where this file starts becoming uncomfortable. Because if Anthony was hundreds of miles away in Utah, how was he supposedly seeing Chris enter a specific dentist office in Colorado? How did he know about her license plate? How did he get close enough to Daniel's workplace to photograph him? There were also explicit threats against Daniel. One message suggested that if Daniel were removed from the picture, Chris and the sender could be together. Another claimed security at Daniel's workplace was weak and that the sender had been inside the building for weeks. Give the signal, the message implied, and Daniel wouldn't make it home. This wasn't just unwanted contact anymore. Chris believed somebody was studying the family. Daniel said he became constantly alert. Chris started checking around her vehicle whenever she went out. The ordinary parts of life became suspicious. A parking lot. A car behind you. Someone standing too long near a doorway. The problem with stalking is that once the victim believes someone may be watching, almost anything can become evidence of danger. And Chris responded in a very specific way. She didn't simply wait. She built a case. She opened a spreadsheet and began documenting everything. Dates. Times. Phone numbers. Email addresses. Screenshots. Content. Every contact. She organized it into what was essentially a stalker log.
She also built a timeline covering her history with Anthony going back years. That part tells you something useful about Chris. Fear wasn't making her passive. It was making her analytical. She hired a private investigator. The investigator located Anthony in Utah. Chris now had an address. On November 7th, she went back to police with the material she had collected. And she wanted something done. She had the messages. She had threats. She had a suspect's name. She had his location. Why not go speak to him? Police had a problem. They could not yet prove Anthony was sending the messages. A phone number can be spoofed. An email address can be created under a false identity. A sender writing, "I'm Anthony," does not make him Anthony. Investigators wanted technical records. Subscriber information. Account data. Digital evidence connecting those communications to a real person. And they worried that approaching Anthony too early could make things worse. If he really was the stalker, confronting him without enough evidence might provoke him. So police made a decision that would later become painful to look back on. They would wait. They began the process of getting digital warrants. Requests went to 3 companies, including Google. And then, nothing. Days passed. Then weeks. No useful answer came back. Large technology and communications companies handle enormous numbers of law enforcement requests every year. The source material for this case notes more than 300,000 such requests annually. Chris's request was urgent to Chris. Inside a corporate queue, it was one more request waiting to be processed. Police were waiting for data. The companies were processing paperwork. The system was technically moving. But Chris was still waking up every morning believing somebody wanted her husband dead. And she wasn't going to sit there unprotected. She installed more security. She learned how to use a gun. She shared her location. Her family practiced what they would do if someone broke into the house. By December, Chris had prepared for almost every version of the threat she could imagine. There was only one problem. She was preparing for a person trying to get inside. Nobody had seriously considered what it would mean if the person was already there. Chris and Daniel installed cameras around the property. 3 security cameras. 1 video doorbell. The goal was obvious. No blind spots. Front. Back. Side. Garage. If somebody returned to the property, there should be a record. Chris also enrolled in firearm safety training. She applied for the required permit and took shooting lessons. Her father initially loaned her a .22 caliber handgun for protection. Chris later replaced it with a new 9mm handgun. She carried it when she went out. She also carried pepper spray. The family practiced emergency scenarios with their 3 children. What happens if somebody kicks in the door? Which room do you go to? Who calls police? Where do the children move? Chris arranged for a trusted family member to have continuous access to her phone's GPS location. She documented the threats. She checked her car. She hired an investigator. She contacted police repeatedly. It's difficult to look at that list and think of something obvious she failed to do. And yet the messages kept arriving. December 6th brought something different. 8 days before Chris was killed, an email arrived that appeared to come from Anthony. The tone had changed again. The sender said he was done. He wouldn't come to Colorado anymore. His girlfriend didn't want them communicating. They were finding a new place to live on the East Coast. Basically, goodbye. For more than 2 months, the messages had been aggressive, threatening, possessive. Then suddenly, the person simply announced that it was over. And I want to pause on that. Because this isn't proof of anything by itself. People stop harassing other people. Circumstances change. A new relationship could matter. But why announce it?
Why send a formal goodbye after weeks of trying to frighten someone? If the goal was genuinely to disappear, disappearing would have worked. Still, from Chris's point of view, there was an understandable temptation to believe it. The messages stopped. Maybe the nightmare really was ending. 8 days later, Chris was found dead in her garage. Police initially looked exactly where you would expect them to look. Anthony. The old boyfriend. The man whose name appeared in the messages. The man supposedly following Chris. The man supposedly photographing Daniel. The man supposedly threatening to remove Daniel so that he could be with her. Law enforcement in Utah was contacted quickly. Officers went to Anthony's home. They didn't begin by telling him Chris was dead. They asked whether he knew her. Anthony said yes. She had been his girlfriend many years earlier. When had he last spoken to her? Around 2016, he said. Some messages on Facebook. Nothing recent. Then police asked about his movements. Anthony produced something surprisingly ordinary. A store receipt. It showed that he had bought a sweatshirt near where he lived in Utah around midday on December 14th. Chris had likely been attacked around 8 that morning in Colorado. The drive between Anthony's area and Broomfield took roughly 8 hours one way. The timing did not work. And there was more. Anthony had employment records. He had been working locally. The source material says he had even worked an overnight shift shortly before Chris was killed. Police checked. Anthony's alibi held. The man who had dominated this investigation for more than 2 months wasn't in Colorado. He wasn't the person in the garage. He wasn't even close. That is the moment when this investigation really changes. Because if Anthony didn't do it, the obvious question becomes: who had been using Anthony's name? And police suddenly had to reconsider every message Chris had received. Every threat. Every reference to her location. Every photograph. Every email. Every part of the supposed stalking campaign. What if the investigation had not been chasing the stalker? What if it had been chasing a character? Detectives returned to the security system. For cameras had protected the home. Or were supposed to. Something had happened around 8:15 that morning. 3 of the 4 cameras went offline. The front. The side. The rear. And this was not a neighborhood power failure. It was not the internet collapsing. System logs showed that the cameras had been manually turned off through the mobile application. Someone had deliberately disabled them. The video doorbell had received an extra layer of protection. That strip of blue tape the officer noticed when he arrived? Investigators traced it to a roll kept in the kitchen. Inside the house. So now ask the question police had to ask. If an outside stalker had approached this home, how did that person know how to access the family's camera system? How did he have the credentials needed to shut 3 cameras down from the app? And how did he end up using tape from the kitchen? The person interfering with the cameras didn't just know the house. They knew the security system. There was one more problem. The 4th camera hadn't been turned off. The garage camera stayed online. And that camera gave police something incredibly valuable. A record of who actually entered and left the home that morning. Around 6:45 a.m., Daniel's vehicle left. A couple of minutes later, he returned. He had taken one of the children to the bus stop. Around 7:42, Chris left with another child. She came back around 7:58 and entered through the garage. Around 8:24, Daniel drove away again. This time, toward work. And around 8:56, while Daniel was already driving away from the neighborhood, his phone received the text from Chris asking whether he could pick up a child later. Look only at those timestamps and Daniel still appears protected. Chris enters the garage at 7:58. Daniel leaves at 8:24. Chris texts him at 8:56. So whatever happened must have happened sometime after 8:56. Except the medical findings made the morning window uncomfortable.
And the cameras created another problem. Police canvassed the neighborhood.
42 homes.
They gathered available security footage. If an outsider had entered the area around the relevant time, investigators expected to see something.
A car. A person. Someone walking. Someone approaching the property.
They found nothing convincing.
And the garage camera showed only the people who were supposed to be there. Chris. Daniel. No unknown visitor. No stranger arriving. No mysterious car pulling up. So now the investigation had two facts that did not sit well together.
The apparent stalker was in Utah.
And the cameras showed no outsider entering Chris's home.
But Chris was dead. Which meant police had to stop asking how the stalker got into the house. And start asking whether the stalker had ever been outside it in the first place. Before Chris died, police had already sent legal requests seeking information behind the anonymous accounts and phone numbers.
Those requests moved slowly.
The case was still being treated as a stalking investigation. Once Chris was killed, the situation changed. This was now a homicide investigation. The companies responded much faster. And when the data came back, the person pretending to be Anthony began to lose the anonymity that had protected him for months. Investigators traced the threatening communications.
The emails. The messages. The accounts. Again and again, the digital trail pointed to the same place. Not Utah. Colorado. More specifically, the office building used by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment.
That was Daniel's workplace.
Hold on. Because this is where the entire case starts feeling different.
A stalker supposedly living in Utah had been sending communications through an internet connection associated with the building where the victim's husband worked.
Could that be coincidence? Possibly. An IP address alone doesn't always tell you exactly who was sitting at a device.
So police kept going.
Some of the harassment had been sent from a prepaid burner phone. That sounds smart. A burner phone doesn't necessarily have a normal subscriber account with a person's name attached to it. But a burner phone still has a history. Somebody has to buy it. Somebody has to activate it. Somebody has to carry it.
Investigators determined that this particular phone had been purchased months earlier at a pharmacy. The payment method was a Visa gift card.
And that gift card was registered to Daniel. That's harder to explain.
Still, maybe someone else obtained the card.
Maybe somebody else used it.
So police looked at location data. The burner phone and Daniel's personal phone appeared in the same places.
Not once. Repeatedly. Same areas. Same time periods. Two devices moving together. One belonging openly to Daniel. The other sending messages pretending to be Anthony.
Then investigators found a tiny exchange.
One word.
October 2nd, the day the first Anthony message was sent to Chris, the burner phone sent another message.
Not to Chris. To Daniel's work phone. The message said, "Test."
A few minutes later, Daniel's work phone replied,
"Yes." That's the kind of evidence that doesn't look dramatic on paper. No confession. No threatening language. Just test and yes.
But put it next to the burner phone purchase.
Put it next to the location data. Put it next to the workplace IP address. And it becomes very difficult to treat that burner phone as a stranger's device.
Police had another piece to examine.
The photograph. Remember the picture Chris received of Daniel at his workplace? The photograph that convinced her the stalker had crossed from online harassment into physical surveillance?
Investigators examined Daniel's phone data. The image had been created using the front-facing camera on Daniel's own phone.
And the camera had been operating with a timer. Read that again.
The photograph presented to Chris as evidence that a stalker was physically close to Daniel had apparently been taken by Daniel's own device. Investigators reconstructed what could have happened. The phone could be positioned.
The timer activated. Daniel could move into frame. The camera would take the picture.
Then the image could be sent to Chris from an anonymous account with threatening language attached.
The stalker's most convincing proof of surveillance was self-produced. And once you understand that, older details start looking different. The dentist. How did the stalker know exactly where Chris went? The expired registration. How did the stalker know details visible to someone close to her daily routine? The threats against Daniel. Who benefited if Chris believed Daniel was in danger? The fake adult advertisement. Who had access to Chris's real name and private number?
None of those questions alone proves who killed her. But investigators were no longer looking at random anonymous harassment. They were looking at a coordinated deception. And the person at the center of that deception appeared to be inside Chris's own life. Still, there was one major obstacle.
Daniel's timeline. 8:24. Daniel drives away. 8:56. Chris texts him. The message is sitting there. Real device. Real timestamp. Real delivery.
For a moment, even with all the strange digital evidence, that text continues to create a problem. Because if Chris sent it at 8:56, Daniel had already been gone for more than half an hour.
Unless she didn't send it at 8:56. Investigators examined Chris's phone.
The text had been prepared in advance.
Scheduled. It was set to send later.
Meaning the time a message left Chris's phone was not necessarily the time Chris was using that phone.
That is the detail from the beginning. The apparent proof that Chris was alive after Daniel left was artificial. And it wasn't the only message.
Chris's phone had also been used to prepare communications to her brother and to the officer handling the stalking investigation. Those messages suggested Chris might have been having an affair.
Investigators found no basis for that story. The implication was obvious.
If police believed Chris had a secret romantic relationship, then they had another possible suspect.
Another person to chase. Another direction away from the house. Look at how many layers there were now. Anthony. A real former boyfriend presented as a stalker. An anonymous campaign made to look like Anthony. A photograph made to look like surveillance. A text made to look like an alibi.
Messages made to look like evidence of an affair.
This wasn't simply concealment.
It was narrative construction.
Someone appeared to be trying to control what Chris believed before her death.
And what police would believe afterward. Then investigators looked at activity on Chris's phone that morning.
The last known manual interaction was around 8:22. 2 minutes before Daniel's vehicle was captured leaving.
That matters because the prosecution would eventually argue that whatever happened inside that garage happened before Daniel drove away. The 8:56 text had pushed the apparent timeline forward.
Without it, the window moved backward. Back into the period when Daniel was still home. And there was one more piece of digital evidence.
A search made the night before Chris died. Investigators found queries concerning how much force would be required to strike someone in the head hard enough to cause unconsciousness.
Another search asked how long unconsciousness could lead to brain damage. The following morning, Chris was found with a severe blunt force injury to her head. A search result isn't a murder weapon. But the timing was difficult to ignore. December 13th.
Searches about incapacitating someone through a blow to the head.
December 14th.
Chris is found with that exact category of injury. By this point, detectives weren't simply looking at a husband whose wife had been murdered while he was away at work. They were looking at the person connected to the burner phone.
The workplace IP. The fake surveillance photo. The scheduled text. The disabled cameras. And the searches. Police obtained an arrest warrant.
December 16th, 2 days after Chris was found, Daniel was arrested in a supermarket parking lot.
But arresting him answered only one question. The larger question was harder. Why spend more than 2 months building an imaginary stalker? Why manufacture an entire person? Why make your own family afraid? To understand that, investigators had to look at what was happening inside the marriage before the first anonymous message was ever sent. And that brought them to a possibility much darker than revenge from an old boyfriend. The stalker may never have been designed to destroy the marriage. He may have been created to save it. From the outside, Chris and Daniel had the kind of life people often describe as stable. Both were 43. Both had careers. 3 children. A home in a good community. Years of marriage. Chris had spent 19 years with Agilent Technologies and worked in project management. Daniel worked in operations and administration for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They had met online during their college years. There had been a period of long-distance dating before Daniel returned to Colorado. They married in 2007. By the time Chris died, their children were 16, 13, and 10. Daniel also had something in his background people often associate with discipline and leadership. He had become an Eagle Scout, a distinction earned by only a small percentage of scouts. None of that resembles the person police were now building a case against. But Chris's family described another side of the marriage. Her father told investigators Daniel could be intensely controlling. He wanted things handled his way. Family decisions. Money. The children. And when things moved outside the structure he wanted, his behavior could change. Chris and Daniel had reportedly been sleeping separately in the months before her death. Chris told her mother she felt as though she was carrying the family. She had reached a point where she wanted a divorce. That matters. But we need to be careful here. Wanting a divorce does not automatically explain a killing. Control issues do not automatically explain a killing. Police still needed to understand why the stalking campaign fit into that conflict. Their theory became this. The original goal may not have been to kill Chris. The goal may have been to frighten her. Imagine the psychological effect. Chris believes an obsessive former boyfriend has returned after more than 20 years. He knows where she goes. He knows where Daniel works. He has access to her phone number. He can send strangers toward her through an adult advertisement. He knows which dentist she visits. He threatens Daniel. He suggests he has entered Daniel's workplace. Then someone apparently breaks into the house and steals a key. What does that create? Dependency. A reason to stay close. A reason not to separate. A reason to believe the world outside the marriage is dangerous. And who stands beside Chris while all of this is happening? Daniel. The husband. The person who can help change the locks. Install cameras. Protect the children. Respond to the threats. Be the safe person. If investigators were right, the stalker was never meant to separate Chris and Daniel. The stalker was meant to push Chris back toward Daniel. Now go back to the missing key. Nothing valuable was taken. Only a spare key. Police later believed that break-in may have been staged too. There may never have been an outsider inside the home. If so, the missing key becomes the opening scene of the entire deception. Someone can get into your house. Someone has your key. Someone might come back. Then the messages appear. Then the surveillance. Then the threats. Each stage increases the pressure. But the plan appears to have had the opposite effect. Chris didn't become more dependent. She became more independent. She hired a private investigator. She organized evidence. She went to police. She learned to shoot. She obtained a firearm. She established GPS monitoring. She created family emergency procedures. Instead of moving closer to Daniel because she needed protection, Chris started building her own protection. And according to the case material, she eventually began questioning the central assumption. Anthony.
Chris told her sister something disturbing before her death. She couldn't even rule out the possibility that her own husband was the stalker. That means the deception may have been failing on two levels. Chris was still moving toward divorce.
And Chris was starting to question the stalker's identity. Her family had questions too. The photograph bothered them. How does someone photograph Daniel from such close range in a parking lot without Daniel seeing him? The stalker seemed to know too much. Not broad information. Specific daily information. When Chris left. Where she went. Which office she entered. Details that are easier to know if you're very close to somebody. And hanging over everything were those digital warrants. Daniel would have known the harassment was being investigated. If he had created the accounts and devices, he also had reason to know that technical records could eventually be returned. IP information. Account records. Location data. The things police later obtained within the murder investigation. The source material presents this as the pressure closing around him. The marriage was collapsing. The stalking strategy wasn't keeping Chris close. And the digital records that could expose the campaign were still pending. That brings us back to December 6th. The goodbye email. The supposed stalker tells Chris he's finished. He isn't coming to Colorado. He has a girlfriend. They're going somewhere else. The threat is over. Prosecutors would later view that message very differently. Not as a stalker deciding to stop. As part of the final setup. If Chris believed the danger had passed, she might lower her guard. She might stop expecting an attack from the outside. 8 days later, she drove back into her garage after taking one of the children to school. The time was about 7:58. Prosecutors believed Daniel was waiting inside. They argued that Chris was struck from behind, leaving her unable to respond effectively. She was then stabbed once in the chest. The 9mm handgun Chris had trained to use was with her. Inside her bag. She never got to it. That detail is difficult to forget. Chris had spent weeks preparing for a stranger. She had gone through training. Bought a gun. Built emergency plans. Installed surveillance. Her preparation wasn't meaningless. She had simply been taught to look in the wrong direction. The prosecution's timeline placed the attack inside a very narrow window. Around 8:15, 3 cameras were manually disabled through the app. The doorbell camera was covered using blue tape from the kitchen. Chris's phone was used to prepare scheduled messages. Its last recorded manual activity occurred around 8:22. Around 8:24, Daniel's vehicle left. The fake text would arrive later. Then workplace surveillance captured Daniel entering his office around 9:27. The performance of an ordinary workday had begun. But the prosecution still had a problem. No murder weapon was ever recovered. No obvious blood evidence was found on Daniel's clothing or inside his vehicle. Investigators did not recover Daniel's DNA from Chris in a way that established the killing. And the defense knew exactly where to attack. 26 minutes. Could Daniel really have done everything prosecutors claimed between Chris returning around 7:58 and Daniel leaving around 8:24? Could he attack her, deal with the weapon, clean himself, manipulate the security system, use her phone and leave for work without leaving the kind of forensic trail you'd expect? That question would become central at trial. And if the case depended only on blood, DNA, or a weapon, Daniel might have had room to fight. But prosecutors weren't building this case around one physical object. They were building it around a digital system of lies. And one woman from Daniel's past was about to tell police that she had seen something disturbingly similar before. Daniel's arrest made the news. A woman named Kelly saw the reports. She knew Daniel. Years earlier, from high school into college, Kelly had been his girlfriend. When she saw the words being used around the investigation, anonymous messages, impersonation, stalking, false identities, she contacted police. Because to her, the pattern wasn't new.
Kelly told investigators that when she ended her relationship with Daniel around the end of college, unusual messages began arriving. One sender claimed to be a man named Tom.
Tom supposedly was Daniel's roommate.
The message was designed to make Kelly worry about Daniel.
Daniel was doing badly.
He might hurt himself.
Kelly needed to come back.
Then more identities appeared.
Different names. Different accounts.
But the purpose stayed similar.
Pressure. Threats. Attempts to push Kelly back toward Daniel. Kelly eventually went to police.
According to the case material, investigators traced those communications to Daniel's activity around his college campus.
Daniel hired an attorney. Kelly eventually decided not to continue pursuing the matter. The episode ended.
Or at least it seemed to.
Roughly 2 decades later, Kelly was looking at another investigation involving Daniel and another woman trying to leave a relationship. Once again, anonymous identities. Once again, messages. Once again, emotional pressure.
Kelly reportedly said she was shocked.
But not shocked. She wasn't surprised Daniel might have repeated the behavior.
What shocked her was how far it had gone this time. This history mattered to prosecutors because it gave context to the methods.
But it didn't eliminate the defense's strongest point. A pattern is not proof of murder.
The state still had to prove what happened to Chris. April 4, 2025, Daniel went to trial.
The prosecution laid out the morning piece by piece. 6:45. Daniel leaves to take a child to the bus stop. 6:47. He returns. 7:42. Chris leaves to take another child to school. 7:58. She returns through the garage. The state argued Daniel was waiting for her.
Chris was attacked.
Around 8:15, cameras were shut down.
The doorbell lens was covered. Chris's phone was used.
Messages were prepared. Around 8:22, the phone shows its final manual activity. 8:24. Daniel drives away.
Later, the scheduled message asking about the child's pickup reaches him.
9:27.
Daniel is captured arriving at work.
It's a tight timeline. Very tight. And the defense leaned into that. Where was the weapon? Never found. Where was the blood on Daniel?
According to the defense, investigators did not find it on the clothing he wore or inside his vehicle.
Where was the DNA linking Daniel physically to the attack? The defense argued that evidence was missing too.
And then there was the question of cleanup. Could somebody commit a violent killing, deal with the weapon, leave the garage, manipulate multiple devices and appear normal enough to drive to work?
All within that short period? The defense said no. It didn't make sense. And that's a fair question to ask. The prosecution did something interesting in response.
They didn't spend their entire case trying to produce a perfect explanation for every missing drop of forensic evidence.
They went back to the digital trail. The anonymous communications connected to the IP address at Daniel's workplace. The burner phone. The gift card registered to Daniel. The burner phone repeatedly moving in the same locations as Daniel's personal phone. The test message sent from the burner phone to Daniel's work phone. The response. The supposedly candid surveillance photograph that came from Daniel's own front-facing camera. The camera timer. The staged appearance of being watched. The scheduled messages from Chris's phone. The messages designed to suggest an affair. The camera system being manually disabled. The blue tape from inside the kitchen. The absence of an unknown person on surrounding cameras.
Anthony's alibi in Utah.
The searches about knocking a person unconscious the night before.
And Kelly's description of a similar anonymous harassment pattern years earlier.
Any one of those pieces has questions. Together, they tell a much more difficult story to explain away. There is another way to think about the evidence. Imagine Daniel is innocent. Then somebody else has to account for all of this. That person must impersonate Anthony. Use an IP address associated with Daniel's workplace. Obtain a burner phone purchased with a gift card registered to Daniel. Carry that burner phone alongside Daniel's personal phone repeatedly. Send Daniel's work phone a test message and receive a response. Create a photograph using Daniel's own phone. Know the family's security credentials. Access tape from the kitchen. Schedule messages from Chris's device. Avoid every neighborhood camera. Leave no clear record entering or leaving. And kill Chris during a time window when the garage camera records no outsider. That's the problem with cumulative evidence. A defense may offer an alternative explanation for one piece. Maybe even two. But every additional coincidence makes the alternative story heavier. The jury listened to roughly 2 weeks of testimony. Then the jurors went out to deliberate. A day passed. Then part of another. And the verdict came back. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of stalking causing serious emotional distress. Guilty of stalking involving a credible threat. Guilty of criminal impersonation. Every major charge. April 18, 2025, Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Additional stalking and impersonation sentences added another 9.5 years to be served consecutively. Legally, the case had reached its ending. But if you stop there, you miss the part that makes this file so unsettling. Because the most disturbing evidence isn't really the burner phone. It isn't even the scheduled text. It's what the entire scheme did to Chris before she died. For more than 2 months, someone reshaped the world around her. Every parking lot became suspicious. Every unknown number mattered. Every car near her workplace or dentist could be the stalker. Her own daily routine became evidence that somebody was watching. And the person allegedly helping her survive that fear was, according to the jury's verdict, the person manufacturing it. That idea becomes even harder to sit with when you return to one small moment involving Chris's daughter. Chris's oldest daughter had a performance coming up. Dance mattered in this family. Chris had danced since she was young. She understood rehearsals, costumes, makeup, the small work behind the curtain that nobody in the audience sees. When her daughter performed, Chris normally helped. But the stalking situation had become so serious that safety concerns followed the family into the school. According to the source material, Chris was discouraged from attending rehearsal. There was even concern about whether she should be present at the performance itself. Think about what that means. Before Chris lost her life, the fake stalker had already started removing pieces of it. A mother couldn't safely stand backstage with her daughter because everyone believed an obsessed man might appear. The family changed locks. They installed cameras. They practiced intruder drills. Chris carried pepper spray and a gun. She let someone monitor her location. She kept records of strangers sending sexual messages because her number had been published without her consent. She walked through parking lots feeling watched. And the entire time, investigators were waiting for records that could identify whoever was doing it. That delay becomes one of the most painful parts of the file. Police didn't ignore Chris. They had reports. They took material. They applied for digital information. They had a strategy. The reasoning was not absurd. They wanted evidence before confronting Anthony. They did not want to alert a potentially dangerous stalker without enough legal leverage to stop him. The problem was timing. The data Chris needed existed. It simply wasn't returned quickly enough. Once the case became a homicide, the companies responded almost immediately. And those same records began exposing the truth. That doesn't mean investigators could have known exactly what would happen. It doesn't mean one earlier phone call would definitely have saved Chris. The file does not support that certainty. But it leaves an uncomfortable question. How different would the final days of her life have been if the digital records had arrived while she was still alive? Maybe Chris would have known Anthony wasn't the stalker. Maybe police would have focused elsewhere.
Maybe the fake world around her would have collapsed.
We can't know.
But we do know Chris had begun questioning it herself. She had told her sister she could not rule out Daniel. And that's important because it changes the way we see her.
Chris wasn't blindly fooled until the end. She was noticing cracks.
She just didn't have the technical records to prove what those cracks meant. The same is true of her family.
That close-up photograph of Daniel bothered them. Too close. Too clean.
How could somebody sit or stand near Daniel long enough to photograph him while Daniel noticed nothing?
The stalker's knowledge bothered them too. Knowing a person is somewhere in a shopping complex is one thing. Knowing which dental office they walked into is another.
There was no tracker on Chris's car.
Yet someone seemed to know exactly where she went. Maybe that should have pointed inward sooner. But the Anthony identity was powerful because Anthony was real.
That's what made the deception convincing.
Daniel didn't invent a fictional name that could collapse the first time police checked.
The person impersonated in the messages had a real history with Chris.
A real breakup.
Real past attempts to contact her.
Real emotional context. If you're building a believable false suspect, that is much stronger than inventing John Smith. There is enough truth around the lie that the lie feels natural. Anthony had dated Chris.
Anthony had reached out years earlier. Anthony had expressed that he missed her. So when a message saying "I'm Anthony" appears, the brain fills in the rest.
Maybe he came back. Maybe he became obsessed. Maybe he finally crossed a line. That is how misdirection works best. Not by creating something completely false. By taking something true and bending it.
The same technique appears again with the 856 text.
The message itself wasn't absurd.
It was the kind of thing Chris might normally send.
Can you pick up the child later? Daniel asks what time. Ordinary family logistics. That's exactly why it worked. A dramatic message would attract attention.
A normal message becomes invisible.
It sits there in the timeline and quietly tells investigators. Chris is alive. Daniel is gone. Move the time of death forward. Look somewhere else.
And investigators initially did. The same with the alleged affair messages.
Use Chris's own phone. Make the messages sound like something investigators have to consider. Create a possible romantic motive. Another suspect who doesn't exist. Another corridor for police to walk down. This case wasn't built around one lie.
It was built around layers of small believable things.
A real ex-boyfriend. A real photograph. A real phone. A real text message. A real security system. A real missing key. Each physical thing existed. What was false was the meaning attached to it.
That's why the blue tape matters so much to me.
It's almost ridiculous. A strip of tape. Nothing sophisticated. But that strip of tape came from inside the kitchen.
The person hiding from the camera didn't bring specialized equipment. They used something already in the house. And that tiny detail mirrors the entire scheme.
The threat appeared to come from outside. The materials came from inside.
The messages appeared to come from Anthony.
The digital trail came from Daniel's environment. The photograph appeared to come from a stalker. The camera was Daniel's. The alibi appeared to come from Chris.
The message was scheduled.
Again and again, the surface points outward. The evidence points inward. And when you see the pattern, the first reported break-in looks different too.
The spare key supposedly stolen from the garage.
No jewelry. No cash. No obvious property. Just the thing that would make Chris believe somebody could return.
If police were right that the break-in was staged, it wasn't random. It was psychological preparation.
The first act of the stalker story. Someone has access to your home. Then someone contacts you. Then someone watches you. Then someone threatens your husband. Then someone says he's leaving. And shortly after that, Chris is dead.
The prosecution believed the scheme changed purpose over time.
Fear had failed to keep Chris in the marriage. She was still preparing to leave. She was becoming stronger.
And she was becoming suspicious. The same system meant to make her rely on Daniel may have made her more determined not to.
That leaves one final question. Was there any point when Daniel could have simply stopped? The anonymous messages could have ended. The fake accounts could have disappeared. The burner phone could have been thrown away.
Chris might still have left him.
The truth might eventually have come out.
But she would have been alive. Instead, the deception appears to have reached the point where preserving the lie became tied to preserving control. And once investigators received the data, both collapsed at once.
Go back to the opening of this file. 12:19 p.m. Daniel calls police. He can't reach Chris. He's worried. There has been a stalker. There have been threats. Can someone please check the house? 9 minutes later, an officer arrives.
The doorbell camera is covered.
Chris is in the garage.
Her mother arrives.
Daniel comes home from work.
And he says he should have protected her.
That sentence hits differently once you know the rest.
Because protection had become the central theme of their lives. Chris was supposedly being threatened by a man from her past.
Daniel was supposedly being threatened too. Their home needed better locks. Their family needed cameras. Chris needed self-defense training.
The children needed emergency drills. They needed to watch one another's locations.
And within that environment, Daniel had a natural role. Protector.
The person standing between the family and the outside threat.
That role only works if the outside threat is real. Investigators and prosecutors argued it wasn't.
The stalker was a mechanism of control.
And there is something especially disturbing about creating danger in order to become the person who provides safety. Because the victim doesn't simply fear you. She may trust you more because of the fear you created. She may tell you what she's worried about. Where she's going. What police said. What evidence she has collected. What she plans to do next. She may even sit beside you while discussing how to protect herself from you. Without knowing that you're the person she's describing. Chris kept a stalking log. She built a timeline.
She hired a private investigator.
She found Anthony's address. She took that information to police.
Imagine how close she came to the truth without being able to see the digital evidence police later obtained.
She had the right instinct. Someone knew too much. Someone was too close. The supposed surveillance did not behave like distant surveillance. Her life was too visible to the stalker.
She eventually questioned whether Daniel himself could be involved.
But suspicion is not proof.
And Chris was trying to do this the responsible way.
Document it. Report it. Wait for evidence. The evidence was on its way. It just arrived too late. There is another person worth remembering here. Anthony.
For more than 2 months, his identity was being used in threats he says he didn't send. His history with Chris was turned into motive. His name was placed in the center of a stalking investigation. Then Chris was killed. For the first hours, he was exactly where police looked.
If Anthony hadn't had a strong alibi, think about how much longer that direction could have survived. The receipt.
The work records. The distance between Utah and Colorado.
Those ordinary details helped collapse the false story. The supposed monster became an innocent former boyfriend. And once Anthony was removed, investigators could finally see how strange everything else had been. No outsider on the cameras. No tracker on the car. No explanation for the stalker's exact knowledge. A camera system disabled from an app. Tape from the kitchen. A burner phone moving with Daniel. A gift card tied to Daniel. A test message to Daniel. A photograph from Daniel's own camera. A scheduled text from Chris. Searches made before the attack. A past girlfriend describing similar anonymous pressure. None of those facts needed a dramatic confession. The devices had already been talking to one another. Phones. IP logs. Cameras. Receipts. Account data. Timestamps. And this is probably the strangest irony in the entire file. Chris herself approached the problem almost like an investigator. She made records. She organized information. She preserved screenshots. She built timelines. She wanted the digital evidence. The same kind of evidence she was collecting eventually exposed the scheme. Just not while she was alive to see it. The final legal outcome is clear. The jury convicted Daniel. He received life without parole, along with additional consecutive time for stalking and impersonation offenses. But the verdict isn't the detail I keep coming back to. I keep coming back to the camera at the front door. The blue tape. Because the entire case is sitting inside that image. A family installs a camera because they're afraid somebody outside might come in. And on the morning Chris dies, that camera is covered using something taken from inside the house. The threat had been framed in the wrong direction. Outside. Anthony. A stranger. A car in a parking lot. Someone near the dentist. Someone hiding behind anonymous numbers. Chris spent months looking over her shoulder. But according to the evidence accepted by the jury, the danger did not need to follow her home. It already lived there. And that's what makes this more than a murder built on digital evidence. It is a case about how information can be manipulated until a person no longer knows which parts of their own life are real. A text can be real and still be false. A photograph can be real and still be staged. A person can be real and still be impersonated. A threat can feel completely external while being created by someone sitting beside you. Chris did almost everything people tell victims to do. She documented. She reported. She increased security. She trained. She asked for help. She looked for evidence. She even began questioning the assumption everyone else had started with. And still, the deception survived long enough. Maybe that's the part of this file worth holding on to. The smallest inconsistencies were there. The photograph was too close. The stalker knew too much. The supposed break-in made no financial sense. The stolen item was too specific. The cameras were disabled too cleanly. The goodbye email came too conveniently. The 8:56 message fit Daniel's timeline almost too perfectly. None of those things, by themselves, answered the case. But together they kept asking the same question. What if the story everyone is being told is pointing in the wrong direction? Because sometimes the detail that breaks a case isn't the loudest one. It's the ordinary text message nobody questions. The strip of tape nobody thinks about. The photograph everyone assumes was taken by someone else. And once you look at those details again, the entire story changes.